When I found my beloved Persian cat Whiskers convulsing on my kitchen floor, chocolate smeared around his mouth, and my daughter-in-law Amber standing there with tears in her eyes saying, "It was an accident. I swear I didn't know chocolate was toxic to cats," I knew she was lying. What she didn't know was that I had 27 years of experience as a forensic investigator, and I was about to put those skills to very personal use. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 62 years old, living in the quiet suburbs of Denver, Colorado. For most people, retirement means slowing down, taking up gardening, maybe joining a book club. For me, it meant finally having the time to focus on what I'd always been best at: uncovering the truth. After nearly 3 decades working crime scenes, analyzing evidence, and catching people in their lives, those instincts don't just disappear when you turn in your badge. What my family never understood was that being a forensic investigator isn't just a job. It's a way of seeing the world. You learn to notice the details others miss, to read between the lines of what people say, to understand that the most dangerous lies are often wrapped in tears and apologies. When my son David married Amber 3 years ago, I tried to turn off that analytical part of my brain. I wanted to be just a mother-in-law, not an investigator. But some people make that impossible. The morning it happened started like any other Wednesday. I was having my coffee in the sunroom, watching Whiskers chase dust motes in the morning light streaming through the windows. At 14 years old, he was getting slower, but he was still my constant companion, the cat who had comforted me through my husband's battle with cancer, who had been my steady presence through the loneliest nights of widowhood. Whiskers wasn't just a pet. He was family. Amber had called the night before asking if she could come by to borrow some of my late mother's jewelry for a work event. She'd been doing this more frequently lately, always with some urgent need, always with that breathless way of speaking that made everything sound like a crisis. My investigator instincts told me something was off about these requests, but David seemed happy in his marriage, and I didn't want to be the interfering mother-in-law who created problems where none existed. She arrived at 9:30, dressed in one of those expensive outfits that made me wonder how she and David afforded such things on their combined salaries. David worked in IT support and made decent money, but Amber's job at a marketing firm was entry-level. And yet, she always seemed to have the latest designer handbag or those shoes that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. "Margaret, you're such a lifesaver," she gushed as I let her in, immediately heading toward the jewelry box I kept on my dining room table. "This client presentation is so important, and I need to look absolutely perfect. You know how it is in marketing. Appearance is everything." I watched her rifle through my mother's jewelry with the same methodical way I'd seen burglars work through victims' belongings. Not frantic, not grateful, but calculating. She was evaluating pieces, setting aside the ones that looked most valuable, and I realized this wasn't about a work presentation at all. "Take your time," I said, settling into my armchair where I had a clear view of both the dining room and the kitchen. "I'll just be here with Whiskers if you need anything." That's when I made my first mistake. I left her alone in the main part of the house while I went to the bathroom. It couldn't have been more than 3 minutes, but when I came back, Amber was in my kitchen, standing near the counter where I kept Whiskers' treat jar. She spun around when she heard my footsteps, and I caught something in her expression, a flash of guilt, quickly covered by her usual bright smile. "I was just getting some water," she said, holding up a glass. "Hope you don't mind." But I did mind, because the water glass in her hand was bone dry, and she was standing nowhere near the sink. These were the kinds of details that had made me good at my job, the small inconsistencies that most people overlook, but that always means something significant is happening. 20 minutes later, I found Whiskers. The scene was exactly what you would expect if someone wanted to stage an accidental poisoning. A small piece of chocolate cake on the floor, as if it had been dropped. Whiskers lying nearby, his breathing shallow and erratic. Amber's story was perfectly rehearsed. She'd brought the cake to share, had accidentally dropped a piece when she was getting her purse, and hadn't realized Whiskers had gotten to it until she heard him making strange noises. But forensic investigators don't believe in coincidences, and there were too many things that didn't add up. The piece of cake on the floor was too perfectly placed, not scattered the way food looks when it's actually dropped. The chocolate was dark chocolate, the most toxic kind for cats, not the milk chocolate most people keep around for casual snacking. And most importantly, Whiskers was an old, careful cat who had never shown interest in human food in all his 14 years. As I rushed Whiskers to the emergency vet, Amber's performance continued. She cried real tears, apologized over and over, even offered to pay the vet bills. But I'd interviewed enough criminals to know that the most convincing lies are the ones people tell with genuine emotion. Amber wasn't crying because she felt guilty about an accident. She was crying because she was terrified of being caught. The vet managed to save Whiskers' life, but it was touch and go for 48 hours. During those 2 days, while I sat by his cage watching him fight for every breath, I made a decision that would change everything for Amber. I was going to find out why my daughter-in-law tried to kill my cat, and I was going to make sure she faced the consequences. That night, alone in my house without Whiskers' comforting presence, I did what I always do when faced with a puzzle. I spread everything out on my dining room table and started building a case. Not for court, not for my former colleagues, but for myself. Because 27 years of investigating crimes had taught me that when someone crosses a line this significant, it's never really about what it appears to be about on the surface. I started with the obvious question: why would anyone want to hurt an elderly, harmless cat? In my experience, animal cruelty usually falls into 3 categories: random psychopathy, displaced anger, or elimination of witnesses. Amber had never shown signs of psychopathy in the 3 years I'd known her, and Whiskers had never done anything to earn anyone's anger. Which left the third option, the one that made my blood run cold. What had Whiskers witnessed that made him a threat? I spent the next morning going through my house with the same methodical attention I'd once used at crime scenes. I was looking for anything that seemed out of place, anything that might explain why Amber had really been in my kitchen that day. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. My jewelry box had been carefully rifled through, with several of my mother's most valuable pieces missing. Not the flashy costume jewelry that might catch someone's eye, but the pieces that looked modest but were actually worth thousands. My grandmother's pearl necklace with the antique clasp.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The Art Deco diamond brooch that had been appraised at $5,000. A collection of gold rings that individually weren't worth much, but together represented a significant sum. But the jewelry was just the beginning. My home office had been searched too, though whoever did it was good enough to make it look like nothing had been disturbed. Drawers were in the wrong order. Papers had been moved and replaced, but not quite in their original positions. Someone had been looking for something specific, and they knew enough about investigative techniques to try to cover their tracks. I checked my financial documents first, wondering if Amber had been looking for bank account information or investment records. Everything seemed to be in order, but then I found something that made my heart skip a beat. My safe had been opened. The safe itself was hidden behind a painting in my home office, something I'd installed after my husband died, and I'd inherited his collection of rare coins and some family documents. It was a good safe, not the kind of thing most people could crack, but it showed signs of having been opened by someone who knew the combination. The combination I'd foolishly shared with David 2 years ago when I'd updated my will and wanted him to know where to find important documents if something happened to me. Inside the safe, most things were still there, but there were subtle signs that everything had been examined. My coin collection had been photographed. I could tell because the coins weren't in the exact positions I always left them in, and there were tiny fingerprint smudges on the plastic holders. Several gold coins were missing. Not the most obvious ones, but pieces worth about $3,000 total. More disturbing was what I found in my filing cabinet. Someone had made copies of my financial statements, my insurance policies, and my will. The copies weren't missing, they were just slightly out of order in the way that happens when someone photographs documents and then tries to put them back exactly as they found them. I sat in my home office, staring at the evidence, and for the first time in my career, I wished I was wrong about what I was seeing. Because all of this pointed to something much more serious than simple theft. Someone was planning something that required detailed knowledge of my financial situation and my assets. Someone was building a case for why I might be worth more dead than alive. And the only person who had both access to my house and knowledge of my safe combination was my daughter-in-law. That evening, I called my former partner, Detective Sarah Rodriguez. Sarah and I had worked dozens of cases together over the years, and she understood how my mind worked. More importantly, she was someone I could trust with information that implicated my own family. "Margaret, it's good to hear from you," Sarah said when she picked up. "How's retirement treating you?" "Like a busman's holiday," I replied. "Sarah, I need a favor, and I need it to stay unofficial for now." I explained the situation, careful to stick to facts and avoid speculation. Sarah listened without interrupting, the way she always did when I was walking her through evidence at a crime scene. "So what do you want me to do?" she asked when I finished. "I want you to run a background check on Amber Martinez, maiden name Flores, date of birth March 15th, 1992. And I want you to look into any connections she might have to people with criminal records or financial problems." "Margaret, are you sure about this? These are some serious accusations you're building toward." "I'm not building toward anything yet," I said. "I'm just following the evidence. But Sarah, I need to know who I'm dealing with before I make any decisions about how to handle this." Sarah agreed to do some quiet checking, and I hung up feeling like I was finally taking control of the situation. But that night, as I sat in my home office, listening for sounds that Whiskers would normally make, I realized that I'd already made my decision about how to handle this. I was going to destroy Amber Martinez the same way she tried to destroy my family. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Sarah called early, her voice tight with the kind of professional concern that meant she'd found something significant. "Margaret, we need to meet, not over the phone." We met at a coffee shop downtown, far enough from both our neighborhoods that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. Sarah slid a manila folder across the table to me, and I could tell from her expression that whatever was inside was worse than I'd feared. "Your daughter-in-law has been busy," Sarah said quietly. Amber Martinez, previously Amber Flores, previously Amber Johnson. She's been married twice before, both marriages ending in the husband's accidental death. I felt my blood turn to ice. Accidental? First husband, Marcus Johnson, died in a car accident 6 months after they were married. Single car collision, went off a mountain road at night. She inherited his life insurance and his half of a small business they'd started together. Sarah paused to let that sink in, then continued. Second husband, Carlos Flores, died of food poisoning 2 years later. Severe allergic reaction to shellfish at a restaurant. Amber claims she didn't know about his allergy, but the restaurant staff said she specifically requested that dish be prepared with extra shrimp, which they thought was odd since her husband had told them earlier he couldn't eat seafood. I opened the folder and saw photographs, police reports, newspaper clippings. 2 men, both young and healthy, both dead within years of marrying Amber. Both deaths ruled accidental after cursory investigations. "There's more," Sarah said. "Your daughter-in-law's real name is Amanda Richardson, and she's got a juvenile record for theft and fraud that was sealed when she turned 18. But I called in some favors and got a look at it. She was caught running insurance scams with a boyfriend when she was 17, filing false claims for accidents that never happened. I studied the photographs of Amber's previous husbands. Both men looked like David, clean-cut, trusting, the kind of men who wouldn't question a loving wife's motives. Both men had been worth more dead than alive to a woman who knew how to work the system. The food poisoning case is particularly interesting," Sarah continued. Carlos Flores had updated his life insurance policy just 3 months before he died, doubling the payout and naming Amber as the sole beneficiary. She collected $250,000. And now she's married to my son? Now she's married to your son, and based on what you've told me about her behavior in your house, she's already moved into the assessment phase. Assessment phase. The term we use to describe how predators evaluated their victims before making their move. Amber hadn't been borrowing my jewelry or getting water in my kitchen. She'd been cataloging my assets and looking for weaknesses in my security. "What about David?" I asked. "Has she taken out any new insurance policies on him?" Sarah's expression grew even more grim. "I'm working on that, but these things take time to trace. What I can tell you is that she's been asking questions around David's workplace about his health, his family medical history, whether he has any dangerous hobbies." I felt like I was going to be sick. My son, my careful, responsible son, who had never hurt anyone in his life, was married to a serial killer. And she was already planning his death. "Sarah, what can we do legally? Is there enough evidence to arrest her?" "For what? 2 accidental deaths years apart in different jurisdictions? Some missing jewelry that she could claim was borrowed? As far as anyone knows, your cat ate chocolate that was accidentally dropped. There's no crime we can prove she committed." I stared at the folder containing evidence of 2 murders that would never be prosecuted, and I realized that the system I'd served for 27 years wasn't going to help me save my son's life. But that didn't mean Amber Martinez was going to get away with it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and planned the most important investigation of my career, not to build a case for prosecutors, but to build a trap for a killer. I was going to use every skill I'd learned, every contact I'd made, and every resource I'd accumulated over nearly 3 decades of law enforcement. I was going to feed Amber's marriage to a detective, and by the time I was done, she would understand exactly what it felt like to have your carefully laid plans destroyed by someone who was better at the game than you were. The first phase of my plan required something I hadn't done in 3 years, going back into full investigator mode. I cleared out my spare bedroom and turned it into a command center, complete with whiteboards, evidence boards, and secure filing systems. If Amber thought she was dealing with a lonely widow who could be easily manipulated, she was about to discover her fatal miscalculation. I started by having my house professionally swept for listening devices. 27 years in law enforcement teaches you to never underestimate your opponent, and Amber had already proven she was capable of sophisticated planning. The sweep came up clean, but I had security cameras installed anyway, hidden ones that would capture every angle of my property without being obvious. My next call was to Detective Maria Santos in Phoenix, where Amber's first husband had died. Maria and I had worked a joint task force together about 15 years ago, and I knew she could be trusted with sensitive information. "Margaret Chen is a live and breathe," Maria said when she answered my call. "I heard you finally retired. How's civilian life treating you?" "Like a prison sentence," I replied honestly. "Maria, I need to ask you about a case from your jurisdiction. Marcus Johnson, single car accident about 5 years ago, married to Amber Johnson at the time." There was a pause on Maria's end. "That's oddly specific for a retired investigator to be asking about. You working private security now?" "It's personal. The widow married my son." Another pause, longer this time. "Margaret, I remember that case. It always bothered me, but we didn't have enough to pursue it further. What's your interest?" I explained the situation, including Sarah's background check results and my own observations about Amber's behavior. Maria listened with the kind of focused attention that meant she was taking notes. "I wish I could say I'm surprised, but that case never sat right with me," Maria finally said. "The accident scene was too clean, if you know what I mean. Like someone who knew about accident reconstruction had set it up." "What do you mean?" "The car went off the road at exactly the right spot to make it look accidental, but also at the spot where it would cause the maximum damage. The curve wasn't particularly dangerous, but if you wanted to stage an accident that would be fatal, you'd choose that exact location." Maria agreed to send me copies of the complete case file, including witness statements and forensic reports that hadn't made it into the official summary. What arrived 3 days later confirmed my worst fears about what kind of predator my son had married. Marcus Johnson hadn't just died in a car accident. He'd been systematically isolated from his family and friends in the months leading up to his death. His parents told investigators they'd tried to maintain contact, but Amber always had excuses for why Marcus couldn't come to family gatherings. Work commitments, health problems, anything that would keep him away from people who might notice changes in his behavior or appearance. The toxicology report showed therapeutic levels of several medications in Marcus's system, including sleep aids and anti-anxiety drugs that he'd never been prescribed. When investigators asked Amber about this, she explained that Marcus had been having trouble sleeping and had been taking over-the-counter remedies. The levels weren't high enough to be considered suspicious, just enough to impair reaction time and judgment. Most telling was the life insurance investigation. Marcus had increased his coverage just 6 months before his death, but not on his own initiative. The insurance agent remembered Amber being very involved in the process, asking detailed questions about payout procedures and beneficiary rights. Marcus himself had seemed distracted during the meeting, almost like he wasn't fully present for the discussion. The case file from Carlos Flores in Seattle painted an even more disturbing picture. Carlos had been a successful restaurant manager with no history of food allergies until he married Amber. According to his sister, Carlos had always been careful about shellfish because it made him feel slightly nauseous, but he'd never had a serious allergic reaction. The night he died, witnesses at the restaurant said Amber had been very specific about wanting the chef's special seafood linguine, even though Carlos initially tried to order something else. The server remembered thinking it was odd that she insisted on a dish her husband seemed reluctant to try. What the original investigation had missed was the timing. Carlos had been to see a doctor just 2 weeks before his death, complaining of increasing sensitivity to various foods. The doctor had recommended allergy testing, but Carlos died before the appointment could be scheduled. Amber had been present during the medical consultation and had asked specific questions about severe allergic reactions and how quickly they could become life-threatening. The more I studied Amber's pattern, the clearer her methodology became. She didn't just kill her husbands. She researched their deaths meticulously, setting up circumstances that would appear accidental while ensuring maximum financial benefit. Each murder had been more sophisticated than the last, showing a learning curve that spoke to careful planning and evaluation of results. Now she was married to my son, and I was seeing the early stages of the same pattern. David had mentioned to me several times in recent months that he'd been having trouble sleeping, that Amber had been encouraging him to see a doctor about anxiety. She'd even bought him herbal supplements that were supposed to help with stress, though David said they made him feel fuzzy and disconnected. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed terrified me. Amber wasn't just planning to kill David. She was already beginning the process of making him appear mentally unstable and physically vulnerable. The sleeping problems, the anxiety, the supplements that made him feel disconnected, all of it was designed to create a narrative that would support whatever accident she had planned for him. I knew I had to act fast, but I also knew I had to be smarter than she was. Amber had managed to kill 2 men without consequence because she'd been dealing with investigators who didn't know her pattern. But she'd never faced someone who understood her methods and had the resources to turn them against her. My opportunity came sooner than I expected. David called me on a Thursday evening sounding more tired and confused than I'd ever heard him. "Mom, I think I need to ask you about something, but I'm not sure how to bring it up." "You can tell me anything, sweetheart. What's wrong?" "It's about Amber. She's been acting strange lately, and I'm starting to wonder if maybe she's having some kind of breakdown or something." I felt my heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" "She's been asking me weird questions about my health, about whether I have any heart problems or anything like that. And she keeps pushing me to update my life insurance, saying we need to be more responsible about financial planning." David paused, and I could hear the confusion in his voice when he continued, "Mom, she asked me yesterday if I knew how to swim. We've been to the lake together dozens of times. She knows I can swim, but she asked like she'd never seen me in the water before." The swimming question sent chills down my spine. Amber was evaluating different methods, considering what kind of accident would be most believable for David specifically. The fact that she was already pushing life insurance updates meant she was moving faster than she had with her previous husbands. David, I want you to listen to me very carefully, I said, choosing my words precisely. I think you should come stay with me for a few days. Tell Amber you need some time to think about some work decisions or something. Don't mention that we talked about her behavior. Mom, I can't just leave my wife because she's asking about insurance. That's not reasonable. Then don't leave her. Just come visit your old mother for a long weekend. Bring some clothes and plan to stay through Monday. I'll make your favorite dinner and we can catch up properly. David agreed, though I could tell he thought I was overreacting. He had no idea that those few days at my house might save his life because I was planning to use them to set up a trap that would expose Amber for exactly what she was. That night, I called Sarah Rodriguez and asked her to meet me the next morning. When she arrived at my house, I had everything laid out in my spare bedroom command center, complete with timelines, photographs, and evidence boards that looked like something from a major case investigation. Jesus, Margaret, Sarah said, looking around the room. You've been busy. I've been thorough, I corrected. Sarah, I need you to help me set up a controlled operation, something that will force Amber to reveal her intentions while protecting David from any real danger. I walked her through everything I'd learned, showing her the patterns in Amber's previous marriages and the signs that she was already beginning the same process with David.
Sarah studied the evidence boards with the same attention she'd given to our most complex cases. "What do you want to do?" she finally asked. "I want to make Amber think David is more vulnerable than he actually is while creating opportunities for her to incriminate herself, but I need official backup in case things go wrong." Sarah nodded slowly. "What did you have in mind?" I outlined my plan, which was risky, but had the advantage of using Amber's own methodology against her. If she was planning to make David appear unstable before staging his accident, I was going to help her along while secretly documenting everything she did. The plan required David to be completely unaware of what was happening, which was the hardest part for me as his mother. But if he knew he was being used as bait, his behavior would change in ways that might tip Amber off. She was too smart to be fooled by obvious acting. Instead, I was going to use David's genuine confusion about his wife's behavior to create opportunities for Amber to reveal herself. During his visit to my house, I would make sure he was relaxed and talkative, encouraging him to share details about his marriage that would help me understand exactly how far along she was in her planning. More importantly, I was going to plant information that would make Amber accelerate her timeline, forcing her to make mistakes that could be documented and used against her. When David arrived Friday evening, I was shocked by how tired and disoriented he looked. The confident, sharp man I'd raised had been replaced by someone who seemed constantly confused and overwhelmed. His hands shook slightly when he reached for his coffee cup, and he kept losing track of conversations mid-sentence. "David, how long have you been feeling like this?" I asked gently. "Like what?" "Tired, unfocused? You seem like you're having trouble concentrating." David rubbed his forehead, looking embarrassed. "A few months, I guess. Amber thinks it's just work stress, but I've never had trouble handling my job before. She got me some supplements that are supposed to help, but if anything, I feel worse since I started taking them." I made a mental note to get those supplements tested. If Amber was drugging David, having chemical evidence would be crucial for building a case against her. That evening, I cooked David's favorite meal and let him relax in front of the television while I pretended to do some cleaning. In reality, I was positioning recording devices throughout the house, small ones that would capture conversations when David called Amber to check in. His first call to her was revealing in ways that broke my heart. "Hi, honey. Just wanted to let you know I made it to Mom's house safely," David said, his voice automatically becoming more careful and measured than it had been all evening. I could hear Amber's voice through the phone, though not clearly enough to make out words. Her tone was sharp, questioning. "No, I'm feeling fine. Just tired from the week. Mom made pot roast, and I'm just going to watch some TV and get to bed early." More questioning from Amber, her voice getting higher and more insistent. "I didn't forget to take my supplements. I brought them with me. Yes, I'll take them before bed like always."
The call continued for several more minutes, with Amber seeming to interrogate David about every aspect of his day, his physical condition, and his plans for the weekend. By the time he hung up, David looked exhausted and more confused than before. "Is everything all right?" I asked casually. "Yeah, Amber's just worried about me. She thinks I might be getting sick or something." Saturday morning, David slept until almost 11, which was completely unlike him. When he finally woke up, he seemed disoriented and had trouble remembering where he was for several seconds. I was becoming increasingly convinced that Amber was systematically poisoning him with something that would build up in his system over time. I convinced David to let me take him to see Dr. Patricia Williams, my personal physician, and someone I trusted completely. I told David it was just for a routine checkup, something to ease his mind about the fatigue and concentration problems he'd been having. Dr. Williams had been my doctor for 15 years, and she understood when I called ahead to explain the situation. She agreed to run a comprehensive toxicology panel along with the standard blood work, looking specifically for substances that might cause the symptoms David was experiencing. The blood draw gave me an opportunity to implement the most crucial part of my plan. While David was distracted with paperwork, I quietly asked Dr. Williams to include testing for compounds commonly found in sleeping aids and anti-anxiety medications, even if David wasn't prescribed anything. More importantly, I asked her to prepare a false medical report that I could use to bait Amber into revealing her intentions. "I need her to think David has a serious heart condition," I explained quietly while David was in the bathroom, "something that would make an accidental death more believable." Dr. Williams looked uncomfortable with the deception, but she understood the stakes involved. "Margaret, this is incredibly dangerous. If this woman is really planning to kill him, then giving her a medical reason to do it sooner might be the only way to catch her in the act."
Patricia, I need you to trust me on this. I've been setting traps for criminals for nearly 30 years. The doctor agreed to prepare a fake report showing irregular heartbeat patterns and recommending further cardiac testing. The report would suggest that David had an undiagnosed heart condition that could be dangerous under stress, exactly the kind of medical vulnerability that Amber had leveraged in her previous murders. Sunday evening, when David called Amber to update her on his weekend, I made sure he had the fake medical report in his hand. "Actually, something kind of scary happened today," David said into the phone, reading from the script I'd helped him prepare. "Mom convinced me to get a checkup, and the doctor found some irregularities in my heart rhythm. She wants me to see a cardiologist next week." Amber's reaction was immediate and intense. Even from across the room, I could hear her voice spike with what sounded like excitement barely controlled as concern. "What kind of irregularities? Did she say how serious it might be? Are you having any chest pain or shortness of breath?" David answered her questions, sticking to the information in the fake report. Amber pressed for more details, asking about symptoms, about what the doctor had said about exercise and stress, about whether the condition could be life-threatening. Her level of interest in the medical specifics was far beyond what a concerned wife would need to know. She was gathering information like someone planning to use it. After David hung up, I sat in my living room staring at the recording device I had hidden near the phone. Amber had just revealed herself more completely than she probably realized. Her questions hadn't been about David's health or how to help him manage a medical condition. They'd been about the logistics of exploiting that condition. Now I had to wait and see how quickly she would move and whether my trap was sophisticated enough to catch a killer who had already gotten away with murder twice. Monday morning, David seemed more alert than he had all weekend, probably because he'd been away from whatever Amber had been giving him. As I drove him home, I felt like I was delivering him into the hands of a predator, even though I knew it was necessary for the larger plan. "Mom, thanks for the weekend. I feel better than I have in months." "Good, sweetheart. And David, I want you to promise me something." "What?" "If you start feeling confused or disoriented again, or if Amber suggests any activities that seem unusual or potentially dangerous, I want you to call me immediately. Don't worry about seeming paranoid or hurting her feelings." David looked puzzled, but agreed. As I watched him walk up the driveway to the house he shared with a woman who was planning his death, I whispered a prayer to my late husband to help me keep our son safe. The next phase of my plan would require perfect timing and nerves of steel, because I was about to turn Amber's own methods against her, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
Tuesday morning at 6:30, my phone rang with the call I'd been expecting, but dreading. It was David, and his voice sounded strange, slurred, and panicked. "David, something's wrong. I can't think straight, and Amber says we need to go to the emergency room. She thinks I'm having some kind of cardiac episode." Every instinct I'd developed over 27 years in law enforcement started screaming. This was it. Amber had taken the bait about David's supposed cardiac condition, and she was moving faster than I'd anticipated. "David, listen to me very carefully. Where are you right now?" "We're in the car. Amber's driving. She says we need to get to the hospital right away because I was having chest pains and my heart was racing." I could hear Amber's voice in the background, urgent and concerned, telling David to stay calm and that everything would be all right. To anyone listening, she sounded like a devoted wife dealing with a medical emergency. But I knew better. "David, which hospital are you going to?" "Amber says Presbyterian Downtown has the best cardiac unit. We should be there in about 20 minutes. Presbyterian Downtown was perfect for what Amber was planning. It was a large, busy hospital where a confused patient having a cardiac event could easily become separated from his wife, where medical errors happened, where someone could disappear into the system long enough for things to go tragically wrong. I grabbed my keys and headed for my car, calling Sarah Rodriguez as I drove. "Sarah, it's happening now. David's in a car with Amber, supposedly having some kind of cardiac emergency. They're headed to Presbyterian Downtown." "Margaret, are you sure about this? Maybe he really is having heart problems." "Sarah, David spent the weekend at my house completely symptom-free until he went home yesterday. Whatever's happening to him started after he got back to Amber. She's drugged him with something, and now she's using the fake cardiac report as cover for whatever she's planning to do at the hospital." There was a pause while Sarah processed this. "What do you want me to do?" "Meet me at Presbyterian. Bring whatever backup you can arrange quietly. I don't want Amber to know law enforcement is involved until we have solid evidence of what she's trying to do."
I made it to the hospital in 15 minutes, parking in the visitor garage and running toward the emergency department entrance. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "In ER room 7, they're running tests. Amber went to get coffee." Room 7 was perfect for Amber's purposes. It was at the end of a hallway, relatively isolated from the main nursing station. If she wanted to do something to David while he was vulnerable and disoriented, she couldn't have asked for a better setup. I found David lying on a hospital bed, looking pale and confused. His pupils were dilated, and his speech was still slightly slurred. Whatever Amber had given him was still working its way through his system. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "David called me," I lied smoothly. "I was worried about you. How are you feeling?" "Weird. Everything seems foggy, and I keep losing track of what people are saying. The doctor says my heart rhythm is irregular, but they need to do more tests to figure out what's causing it." I looked at the monitor beside his bed. His heart rate was elevated, but not dangerously so. His blood pressure was slightly high. Both could be explained by whatever drug was in his system, but to medical staff who didn't know his history, it would look like cardiac distress. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to try to remember clearly. What did you eat or drink this morning before you started feeling sick?" David frowned, clearly struggling to think through the fog in his brain. "Amber made me breakfast, scrambled eggs and coffee. She said I needed to eat something substantial because I'd been looking thin lately." "Did anything taste unusual?" "The coffee was a little bitter, but Amber said she'd tried a new brand. She insisted I finish the whole cup because caffeine would be good for my energy levels." The coffee. That's how she'd delivered whatever cocktail of drugs she'd used to create his current symptoms. I needed to get a sample of his blood drawn for independent testing before the substances cleared his system. "David, I'm going to ask the nurse to draw some extra blood for additional testing. Your father had some unusual reactions to medications, and I want to make sure the doctors have complete information." As I walked toward the nurse's station, I saw Sarah Rodriguez returning from the direction of the cafeteria, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She stopped when she saw me, and for just a moment, I caught a flash of something cold and calculating in her expression before she replaced it with her usual concerned smile. "Margaret, what are you doing here? I didn't call you." David did. He was scared and wanted his mother. I watched Amber's face carefully. I'm sure you understand how frightening this must be for him. Of course, I'm just so worried. The doctor says they need to keep him for observation, maybe overnight. They're concerned about his heart rhythm. Overnight observation was exactly what Amber needed. Hours of time when David would be vulnerable, when she could visit him after normal visiting hours, when she could have access to his IV line or medication schedule. Hospital security was designed to keep dangerous people out, not to protect patients from their own family members. I excused myself and found Sarah Rodriguez in the waiting area, dressed in civilian clothes but with the unmistakable alertness of a cop on duty. "Status?" she asked quietly. "David's been drugged with something that's causing cardiac symptoms. Amber's pushing for overnight observation, which would give her access to him when he's most vulnerable. We need to get him out of here." "Margaret, we can't just remove a patient from the hospital if he's genuinely having cardiac issues. Then we need to make sure he's protected while he's here, and we need to document everything Amber does while we wait for the drugs to clear his system." Sarah nodded and walked toward the security office. While I returned to David's room, Amber was sitting beside his bed, holding his hand and speaking to him in low, soothing tones. To anyone watching, she looked like a devoted wife comforting her sick husband. But I noticed that she was holding his hand in a way that put pressure on his pulse point, and she kept checking her watch as if timing something. When David dozed off briefly, she immediately reached for his water cup and added something from a small bottle she pulled from her purse. I stepped into the room before she could cap the bottle. "What are you giving him?" Amber startled, quickly capping the bottle and slipping it back into her purse. "Just some electrolyte drops. The doctor said he might be dehydrated."
"Which doctor? I'd like to speak with them." "Dr. Martinez. He was just here a few minutes ago." I walked to the nurse's station and asked to speak with Dr. Martinez. The nurse looked confused. "Dr. Martinez isn't scheduled in the ER today. Dr. Thompson is the attending physician for room 7. When I returned to David's room, I saw Amber encouraging him to drink the water she'd tampered with. "David, don't drink that," I said firmly. "Mom, what's wrong? Amber's just trying to help me stay hydrated." "The water might be contaminated. Let me get you a fresh cup from the nurse's station." Amber's facade began to crack slightly. "Margaret, you're being paranoid. I'm just taking care of my husband." "The same way you took care of Marcus Johnson and Carlos Flores?" The room went dead silent. David looked confused, but Amber's expression shifted completely. The concerned wife disappeared, replaced by something cold and predatory. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost its warm, caring tone. "Marcus Johnson, your first husband, died in a suspicious car accident 6 months after you married him. Carlos Flores, your second husband, died of a convenient allergic reaction to shellfish. Both deaths ruled accidental, both resulting in substantial life insurance payouts." David was staring at both of us, trying to process what he was hearing through the fog of whatever Amber had given him. "Amber, what is she talking about? You were married before?" Amber stood up slowly, her hand moving toward her purse. "David, your mother is clearly having some kind of breakdown. We should call security." "Security is already here," Sarah Rodriguez said from the doorway, her badge visible. "Amanda Richardson, also known as Amber Martinez, also known as Amber Johnson, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of David Chen." "You can't arrest me. I haven't done anything wrong. My husband is having a medical emergency, and I brought him to the hospital." "Your husband is having a medical emergency that you caused," Sarah continued, moving into the room with 2 uniformed officers behind her. "We have surveillance footage of you tampering with his water cup, and we're going to test both that water and his blood for controlled substances." As the officers moved to handcuff Amber, she made one last desperate attempt to maintain her cover. "David, don't let them do this. I love you. I would never hurt you." David, despite the drugs in his system, was beginning to understand what had been happening to him. "The coffee this morning, the supplements you've been giving me, the sleeping problems I've been having, that was all you?" Amber's mask finally slipped completely. "You were supposed to die quietly, David, just like the others. If your mother hadn't interfered, this would have been over by now and no one would have suspected anything. The confession was exactly what we needed,
and Sari's recording device had captured every word. As the officers led Amber away, she turned back toward me with pure hatred in her eyes. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've cost yourself. I know things about you, Margaret. I know where you live, what you're worth, what your weaknesses are. This isn't over." "Yes, it is," I replied calmly. "Because you made the same mistake that every criminal I ever caught made. You assumed you were smarter than everyone else, and you underestimated your opposition." The next few hours were a blur of medical tests, police interviews, and paperwork. David's blood work confirmed the presence of several substances that explained his symptoms, a combination of sedatives and stimulants designed to create the appearance of cardiac distress without causing immediate death. The water Amber had tampered with contained a concentrated dose that would have been fatal if David had consumed it.
Thompson confirmed that David's actual heart function was completely normal and that all of his symptoms were drug-induced. With IV fluids and time, the substances would clear his system completely. As David's head began to clear, the full scope of what had almost happened to him started to sink in. "Mom, she was going to kill me. My own wife was planning to murder me." "I know, sweetheart, but she didn't succeed, and she's never going to hurt anyone again." Sarah returned to David's room with an update on Amber's situation. She's being held without bail on attempted murder charges. The district attorney is also reopening the investigations into her previous husband's deaths. With her confession and the evidence we've gathered, she's looking at life in prison. Over the next few days, as the story emerged in local media, I learned more about how close David had come to becoming Amber's third victim. The supplements she'd been giving him contained slow-acting toxins designed to build up in his system over time, creating a medical history that would support a narrative of declining health. The fake cardiac report I'd used as bait had simply accelerated her timeline. The life insurance policy she'd convinced David to update would have paid out nearly $500,000, more than enough to fund whatever new identity she would have assumed after his death. Most chilling was what investigators found when they searched the house David had shared with her. Hidden in her closet was a detailed notebook containing information about David's daily routines, his medical history, his financial assets, and several different scenarios for staging his death. She'd been planning his murder almost from the day they were married. David moved back in with me while he recovered physically and emotionally from what Amber had done to him. It took weeks for all the drugs to completely clear his system, and even longer for him to trust his own judgment again. "I feel so stupid," he said one evening as we sat in my living room. "How did I not see what she was doing to me?" "You're not stupid, David. You're trusting, which is different. Amber was a professional predator who had perfected her methods over years of practice. She was good at what she did. But you saw through her. I saw through her because I spent 27 years learning how predators operate, and because I had the advantage of knowing what had happened to her previous victims." 6 months later, Amber Richardson was convicted on multiple charges related to David's attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The investigations into Marcus Johnson and Carlos Flores were officially reopened as homicide cases, though she was never formally charged due to jurisdictional complexities. David eventually moved into his own apartment, started therapy to deal with the trauma of discovering that his wife had been systematically poisoning him, and began the long process of rebuilding his life. He's doing well now, though he's understandably cautious about relationships. Whiskers made a complete recovery from his chocolate poisoning and is currently sleeping in his favorite spot by the window, completely unaware that his near-death experience helped save his human family from a serial killer. As for me, I learned that retirement doesn't have to mean the end of using the skills I'd spent decades developing. Sometimes the most important cases are the ones that hit closest to home, and sometimes the best use of professional expertise is protecting the people you love most. I also learned that a mother's intuition combined with an investigator's training is a formidable combination. When something seems wrong in your family, trust those instincts. They might be the only thing standing between your loved ones and someone who views them as nothing more than a means to an end.
The chocolate that Amber fed to Whiskers was intended to eliminate a potential witness to her crimes. Instead, it exposed her as the predator she was and led to justice for victims who might not have gotten it otherwise. Sometimes the smallest cruelties reveal the largest truths about who people really are. The trial of Amanda Richardson, known to my family as Amber Martinez, began 8 months after her arrest. As the key witness and the person who had orchestrated the investigation that led to her capture, I found myself sitting in a courtroom for the first time as a victim's family member rather than as a law enforcement professional. The experience was surreal and emotionally exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. For nearly 30 decades, I'd been the one gathering evidence, building cases, and watching from the sidelines as justice played out. Now I was personally invested in the outcome in a way that made every procedural delay and legal maneuver feel like a personal attack. District Attorney Rebecca Morrison had assigned her most experienced prosecutor, James Chen, to handle the case. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me, though James assured me it was purely coincidental. He was a methodical man in his 40s who specialized in complex murder cases, and he understood the unique challenges of prosecuting someone who had perfected the art of making murder look accidental. The problem we face, James explained during one of our pretrial meetings, is that Amanda Richardson is exceptionally good at what she does. She's intelligent, manipulative, and she presents well to juries. We need to show them not just what she did to David, but the pattern of behavior that proves this wasn't an isolated incident. The defense attorney, Patricia Valdez, was equally experienced and had built her reputation on creating reasonable doubt in seemingly impossible cases. I'd researched her background thoroughly, and I knew she would attack every aspect of our evidence while portraying Amber as a loving wife who had been framed by an overbearing former police officer. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Valdez said during her opening statement, "this case isn't about murder or attempted murder. It's about a retired police officer who couldn't let go of the job, who saw conspiracies where none existed, and who used her knowledge of law enforcement procedures to frame an innocent woman for crimes that never happened." It was a clever strategy, and I could see some of the jurors nodding along. The idea that a controlling mother might fabricate evidence against her daughter-in-law was plausible enough to create the reasonable doubt that Valdez needed for an acquittal. James Chen's opening statement was more straightforward and factual. He walked the jury through the timeline of events, from Amber's first appearance in David's life through the hospital incident that had led to her arrest. He explained how the investigation had uncovered her previous identities and the suspicious deaths that had followed her wherever she went. The evidence will show that Amanda Richardson is a serial killer who has perfected a method of murder that's designed to look accidental.
She targets vulnerable men, gains their trust through marriage, and then systematically destroys them while positioning herself to benefit financially from their deaths. David Chen was intended to be her third victim, and he would be dead today if not for his mother's intervention. The first week of testimony focused on David's experience with Amber and the events leading up to his hospitalization. David took the stand on Tuesday morning, looking nervous but determined to tell his story. Under direct examination, he described how Amber had gradually isolated him from friends and family, how she'd convinced him to update his life insurance policy, and how she'd begun giving him supplements that made him feel confused and disoriented. He testified about the morning she'd insisted on taking him to the hospital and how she'd tried to give him the tampered water while he was in the emergency room. "I trusted her completely," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "She was my wife. When she told me I needed to take supplements for my health, I believed her. When she said I looked tired and needed to see a doctor, I went along with it. I never imagined that someone who claimed to love me was slowly poisoning me." Patricia Valdez's cross-examination was brutal but predictable. She focused on David's mental state during the months leading up to his hospitalization, suggesting that his confusion and disorientation could be explained by work stress, relationship problems, or underlying medical conditions that had nothing to do with Amber's actions. "Mr. Chen, isn't it true that you'd been having problems at work during this time period? I was having trouble concentrating, but that was because of what Amber was giving me." "But you can't know that for certain, can you? You never had the supplements tested independently." "No, but, and isn't it true that you'd been drinking more alcohol than usual during this period?" "Sometimes I had a beer or two in the evening, but that's not unusual." Valdez continued this line of questioning for over an hour,
creating a portrait of a man whose marriage was under stress, whose work performance was declining, and who might have been experiencing a mental health crisis that had nothing to do with his wife's actions. When she finished, I could see that some of the jurors were looking at David with sympathy rather than belief. Valdez had successfully planted the seed of doubt about whether David's symptoms were actually caused by deliberate poisoning. The second week focused on the medical evidence. Dr. Patricia Williams testified about the fake cardiac report she'd prepared at my request, explaining how we'd used it as bait to accelerate Amber's timeline. The hospital staff who had treated David testified about his condition when he arrived and the substances found in his blood work. The toxicologist who had analyzed David's blood samples provided some of the most damaging testimony against Amber. Dr. Michael Rodriguez explained that the combination of substances found in David's system could not have occurred naturally or through legitimate medical treatment. The levels and combinations we found are consistent with deliberate administration over a period of several weeks, Dr. Rodriguez testified. These substances would cause exactly the symptoms Mr. Chen described: confusion, disorientation, fatigue, and irregular heart rhythm. Under cross-examination, Valdez challenged Dr. Rodriguez's conclusions, suggesting that the substances could have been prescribed by a doctor whose records were incomplete, or that they could have been taken voluntarily by David without his wife's knowledge. Dr. Rodriguez, is it possible that Mr. Chen was self-medicating for anxiety or sleep problems without telling anyone, including his wife? The specific combination and dosages make that unlikely, but I suppose it's theoretically possible. So you can't say with complete certainty that these substances were administered without his knowledge. I can say that the pattern is highly suspicious and consistent with deliberate poisoning. But you can't rule out other explanations completely. No, I cannot rule them out completely. It was a small victory for the defense, but an important one. Valdez was systematically creating reasonable doubt about every aspect of the prosecution's case. The third week brought the testimony that I'd been both anticipating and dreading: the evidence about Amber's previous marriages and the suspicious deaths of Marcus Johnson and Carlos Flores. James Chen had flown in investigators from both Phoenix and Seattle to testify about the original investigations and what they'd found when the cases were reopened. Detective Maria Santos from Phoenix testified about Marcus Johnson's death and the inconsistencies in the accident scene that had always bothered her. She described the insurance policies that had been updated just months before his death, and Amber's behavior during the investigation. Mrs. Johnson was very cooperative during our initial investigation, but there were certain details about her husband's final day that kept changing. First, she said he'd been feeling fine that morning. Then she said he'd complained of being tired. Initially, she said they'd had breakfast together, but later she remembered that she'd left early for work and he'd eaten alone. Detective Robert Kim from Seattle provided similar testimony about Carlos Flores' death. He described the restaurant incident, the suspicious timing of Carlos's supposed allergy development, and Amber's behavior during the investigation into his death. Mrs. Flores seemed very knowledgeable about severe allergy reactions. For someone whose husband had never supposedly experienced one before, she knew exactly what symptoms to describe, how quickly they would progress, and what the medical response would be. Under cross-examination, both detectives acknowledged that neither case had been prosecuted at the time, that the deaths had been ruled accidental, and that much of their current testimony was based on speculation and hindsight rather than concrete evidence. Mr. Santos, Mr. Johnson's death was investigated thoroughly at the time, wasn't it? Yes, it was. And based on all the evidence available, it was ruled an accidental death. That's correct. Are you testifying today that your department made an error in that determination? I'm testifying that with the benefit of additional information about Mrs.
Johnson's subsequent behavior, there are aspects of the case that warrant further investigation. But you're not here to present new evidence that proves Mr. Johnson was murdered, are you? No, I'm not. Valdez was scoring points with these exchanges, reinforcing her narrative that the prosecution was building a case on speculation and coincidence rather than solid evidence. The fourth week was when I took the stand. James Chen walked me through my background in law enforcement, my investigation into Ever's true identity, and the steps I'd taken to protect David while gathering evidence against her. I testified about finding the jewelry missing from my house, discovering that my safe had been opened, and realizing that Amber was planning something that required detailed knowledge of my assets. Mrs. Chen, what made you suspect that your daughter-in-law was not who she claimed to be?
It was a combination of small inconsistencies in her behavior and my professional instincts. She showed too much interest in certain aspects of my financial situation, and her reaction to finding my cat poisoned was not consistent with someone who was genuinely upset about an accident. I described the investigation process, explaining how I'd contacted former colleagues and built a case file that revealed Amber's true identity and criminal history. I testified about the surveillance footage from the hospital that showed her tampering with David's water and about the confession she'd made when confronted with the evidence. Patricia Valdez's cross-examination of me lasted 2 full days and was the most intense interrogation I'd ever experienced, including my years in law enforcement. She portrayed me as an obsessive former cop who had never learned to turn off her investigative instincts, someone who had seen sinister motives and normal behavior and had manipulated evidence to support her preconceived conclusions. "Mrs. Chen, you never liked your daughter-in-law from the beginning, did you?" "I had concerns about some aspects of her behavior, but I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt." "You admit that you investigated her background without her knowledge or consent." "I did research that I felt was necessary to protect my son." "You illegally accessed confidential police records from multiple jurisdictions." "I used my professional contacts to obtain information that was relevant to an ongoing investigation." "An investigation that you conducted without any official authorization or oversight?" "I conducted a private investigation based on evidence that suggested my family was in danger." By the time Valdez finished with me, I felt like I'd been put through a shredder. She'd managed to make my investigation sound like a vendetta, and I could see that some of the jurors were looking at me with suspicion rather than sympathy. The final week of testimony focused on Amber herself. Against the advice of her attorney, she had insisted on taking the stand in her own defense. It was a calculated risk that would either save her or destroy her completely. Amber's testimony was a masterclass in manipulation. She presented herself as a loving wife who had been blindsided by her mother-in-law's accusations, a woman whose previous marriages had ended in genuine tragedies that she was still struggling to overcome. "I loved David with all my heart," she said, tears streaming down her face. "The idea that I would ever hurt him is so devastating that I can barely comprehend it. When Margaret started making these horrible accusations, I thought she was having some kind of breakdown. I never imagined that she would go to such lengths to destroy my marriage." She explained away the evidence systematically. The missing jewelry had been borrowed with permission and returned. The substances in David's blood could be explained by supplements and medications that he'd taken without her knowledge. The notebook found in her closet contained research she'd been doing about her husband's health concerns, not plans for his murder. David had been having trouble sleeping and feeling anxious about work. I was trying to learn about natural remedies and supplements that might help him feel better. I researched his symptoms because I wanted to be supportive, not because I was planning to hurt him. Her explanation for the hospital incident was equally plausible. She had been genuinely frightened by David's symptoms and had rushed him to the emergency room because she was afraid he was having a heart attack. The water incident was a misunderstanding, she claimed. She'd been adding electrolyte drops recommended by a nurse, not poisoning her husband. When Margaret burst into the room making these wild accusations, I was terrified and confused. I couldn't understand what was happening or why she was saying these things about me. Most chillingly, she managed to present her previous marriages in a way that made her seem like a victim of circumstances rather than a predator. Marcus Johnson's death had devastated her, she claimed. She had been so traumatized by losing her first husband that she had changed her name to try to start over. Carlos Flores had been her attempt to find love again, and his death had nearly destroyed her emotionally. "I know how this must look to people who don't know me," she said, looking directly at the jury. "2 husbands dying in accidents, and now these accusations about David. But sometimes terrible things happen to good people, and sometimes those people are targeted by others who want to blame them for tragedies that were nobody's fault." By the time she finished her direct testimony, several jurors were crying along with her. Amber had managed to flip the narrative completely, transforming herself from a predator into a victim of circumstances and persecution. James Chan's cross-examination of me was critical to the prosecution's case. He needed to break through Amber's carefully constructed facade and reveal the calculating killer underneath.
Richardson, you testified that you loved David with all your heart. Is that why you researched methods of making his death look accidental? I never researched any such thing. You testified that the notebook found in your closet contained health research. Can you explain why this health research included detailed information about life insurance payout procedures? I was trying to understand our financial situation in case something happened to David. Chen continued methodically, forcing Amber to explain inconsistencies in her story and challenging her explanations for the evidence against her. But she was skilled at deflecting his attacks, always managing to provide alternative explanations that sounded plausible on the surface. The breakthrough came when Chen confronted her about the specific timing of events on the morning David became ill. Ms. Richardson, you testified that David complained of feeling unwell when he woke up that morning, but according to phone records, you called the hospital to ask about emergency room wait times at 6:30 a.m., 15 minutes before David says he started feeling sick. There was a moment of silence in the courtroom as the implications of this revelation sunk in. Amber had called the hospital before David showed symptoms, suggesting that she'd known he was going to need emergency medical care because she was planning to cause those symptoms. I may have been confused about the timing. It was a very stressful morning. You may have been confused about when you called the hospital to prepare for your husband's medical emergency? Yes, I think so. Or is it possible that you called the hospital because you knew David was going to need emergency care, because you were planning to give him something that would require immediate medical attention? That's not what happened. But the damage was done. Chen had caught Amber in a lie that undermined her entire testimony, and the jury had seen her facade crack for the first time during the trial. The closing arguments took place on a rainy Friday afternoon. James Chen methodically walked the jury through the evidence, connecting all the pieces of the puzzle that proved Amber's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a woman who has turned murder into a business model. Amanda Richardson, known to her victims as a loving wife, has perfected a method of killing that's designed to look accidental while maximizing her financial benefit. The evidence shows a clear pattern of predatory behavior that spans multiple identities and multiple victims. Patricia Valdez's closing argument was equally compelling, focusing on the lack of direct evidence and the possibility that the prosecution had built their case on coincidences and speculation. The prosecution wants you to believe that Amanda Richardson is a master criminal who has gotten away with multiple murders over several years, but the evidence they've presented is based on assumptions, not facts. They've asked you to convict a woman of attempted murder based on the idea that 3 separate tragedies must be connected simply because they all involved the same person. The jury deliberated for 3 days, which felt like 3 years to me. David and I waited in the courthouse, along with Sarah Rodriguez and other members of the investigation team, barely able to eat or sleep as we wondered whether justice would be served. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, I felt like I couldn't breathe. The foreman stood and announced that they had found Amanda Richardson guilty on all charges: attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. As the verdict was read, Amber's mask finally slipped completely. The grieving widow disappeared, replaced by something cold and furious. She turned toward me with pure hatred in her eyes and mouthed the words, "This isn't over," before the bailiff led her away. Judge Harrison sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years for the conspiracy and assault charges. As he pronounced the sentence, he made it clear that he understood exactly what kind of predator Amber was and why she needed to be permanently removed from society. Ms. Richardson,
The evidence presented in this case reveals a pattern of predatory behavior that represents a clear and ongoing danger to society. You have demonstrated a complete lack of empathy for your victims and a level of calculation in your crimes that suggest you cannot be rehabilitated. The court sentences you to spend the rest of your natural life in prison, where you will never again have the opportunity to harm another person. Walking out of that courthouse with David, knowing that Amber would never hurt anyone again, felt like the culmination of everything I'd learned and accomplished during my career in law enforcement. Sometimes the most important cases are the ones that matter most personally, and sometimes the best use of professional expertise is protecting the people you love most. David continues to recover from the physical and emotional trauma of discovering that his wife was systematically poisoning him. He's in therapy, he's rebuilt relationships with friends that Amber had encouraged him to abandon, and he's slowly learning to trust his own judgment again. As for me, I learned that retirement doesn't mean the end of fighting for justice. It just means choosing your battles more carefully and making sure that when you do fight, you fight for the people and causes that matter most. Sometimes the smallest acts of cruelty reveal the largest truths about human nature. A cat fed chocolate, a husband gradually poisoned, a mother-in-law dismissed as paranoid. But truth has a way of surfacing, especially when someone with the right skills and determination refuses to let it stay buried. Justice isn't always swift, and it isn't always perfect. But sometimes, if you're very careful and very lucky, you can make sure that the right person pays for their crimes even when everyone else has been fooled by their performance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.